Good evening. Today is May 10th, 2021, and this is the 51st episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. Before we begin our broadcast today, I want to wish all the mothers out there a belated Mother's Day. Hope that you enjoyed it and spent time with the family, and I'm hoping that you will have a blessed year in the future to come. My guest today is another mom, Clare Lopez. Clare is the founder and the president of Lopez Liberty LLC, with a mission to alert and also at the same time educate Americans on a range of national security threats, international as well as from the Islamic movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, and collaborators among the ranks of Marxists and communists that are operating within our country. In 2020, Clare was named a senior analyst for Ravinia Associates, which is a strategic corporate communication firm that is based in Virginia. She also works with Bishop E.W. Jackson and his STAND organization. From 2014 to 2020, Ms. Lopez served as a vice president for research and analyst at the Center for Security Policy. She has been a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research and a member of the board of advisors for the Canadian McKinsey Institute. In 2016, she was named to Senator Ted Cruz at the time for the presidential campaign as a National Security Advisory Team member. Lopez has been an instructor on Iran Hezbollah and the Red, Black, and Green Axis for understanding the threat of a national training program on the global Islamic movements and the jihadist networks. Most recently, Ms. Lopez acted as advisor, mentor to U.S. Special Forces students in the fall of 2020 with the Department of Defense course that was run by Reservoir International. From 2013 to 2016, she served as a member of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi and continues as a member of the Citizens Commission on National Security. Formerly the VP of Intelligence Summit, she was a career officer, operations officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies, executive director of the Iran Policy Committee. From 2005 and 2006, she served as a consultant instructor, intelligence analyst, and researcher for a variety of defense firms. She was named a 2011 Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute. In February of 2012, Ms. Lopez was named a member of the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security, which focuses on the electromagnetic pulse EMPs threats to the nations and serves as its director for counterterrorism. She has served as a member of the boards of advisors and director for the Center for Democracies and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, the United West, and also Voice of the Coptics. She has been a visiting researcher and guest lecturer on counterterrorism, national defense, and also international relations at George Washington University. Ms. Lopez is a regular contributor to a range of media and also subject-related expert on Iran and the Middle East, and a co-author of 2 published books on Iran itself. She is the author of The Rise of the Iran Lobby and also co-author editor of the Center B-Team Study on Sharia, the Threat to America, as well as the Tiger Team's The Secure Freedom Strategy, the Plan for Victory on Global Jihad Movements. She has co-authored Gulen and the Gulenist Movement with CPS, Vice President for Outreach, Christopher Holton, Sino Sharia, and also has been very much in discussions on the various different topics that affect Erdogan and the leadership in Turkey, especially with Erdogan's new caliphate, the rise of jihadists, the threats to the West. Lopez received her BA in Communications and French from Notre Dame College in Ohio, a MA in International Relations from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. She completed a Marine Training Corps Officer Candidate School, or OCS, in Quantico, Virginia, before declining a military commission to join the CIA. Clare, I'm happy to see you here. Congratulations on Mother's Day, and good news, your daughter's getting married. I know that last time we were together on our show was on Auntie Kimberly's show, who is the co-founder and editor, of course, of Interscope, and also it was an opportunity for us to finally get together, to get to this point, to finally have you on the show. I know that today we're going to be speaking about China specifically and the threats that are caused by it. As you know yourself, I had done the previous shows that were looking at how China was stealing our F-35 intel technologies and how they're pressuring some of our companies here to possibly use a backdoor to Japan and also through Taiwan to move that intelligence. But I know that today we need to, of course, start with speaking about what's happening in the Middle East, giving you expertise on it. So welcome to the show. And please tell us a little bit about what's happening in the Middle East as we speak today.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really glad to be back on a radio show with you. It's an honor and a pleasure for me this evening. But just as we are talking here, earlier today and really through the previous weekend, which marks nearly now the end of Ramadan, Friday, the 7th of May, here we are, 2021, was the last Friday of Ramadan, which is always marked as Al-Quds Day by the Iranian regime and others across the region, and typically with rioting and protests and demonstrations. But through the weekend, that activity really just increased. It had been ramping up in Jerusalem specifically, really since April, at least a month ago now, with Palestinians rioting, attacking Israeli police, throwing rocks and bottles and other objects at them. As you can see here in this video you've got running, this is probably from either earlier today or perhaps yesterday, when the disturbances up on the Temple Mount, which of course include the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is always a center of disturbances there in Jerusalem, and just really broke out into a lot of violent rioting. The Israeli police had to use, as you can see, a lot of crowd control measures, including tear gas, and I think you can see the flashbangs going off as well there back in the background. That is, of course, the Dome of the Rock, but that whole area up there is the Temple Mount, meaning it is the place that Muslims built these edifices, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, on top of the Jewish destroyed Second Temple. So those clashes went on all day today. Even as it went into darkness, they're 7 hours different from eastern coast United States, I think. The clashes were continuing last I looked. Really, the region is on a knife's edge. Gaza erupted with Hamas firing rockets out of Gaza. I lost count of how many, but quite a few. The Israelis struck back at Gaza and at those sites from which the rockets were being fired. There were a number of casualties, as I understand it, in Gaza. I believe a couple of those at least were senior Hamas military officials. But things are continuing to deteriorate, I guess I would say. The final end of Ramadan, the last day of Ramadan, will be Tuesday, the 12th of May this year. It's different dates each year, not exactly the same. Today also, by the way, coincided for the Jewish people with Jerusalem Day. And that is the day when the Jewish people and Israelis celebrate the reunification of their eternal capital of Jerusalem, reunified during the 1967 war. And so all of these dates are coinciding. I will wager a bet that not many people know that the last day of Ramadan is celebrated as the Eid al-Fitr. But what that actually means in history, folks may not know, but this is what it is. Back in the year 624 CE, current era, 2 years after the Hijrah of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina, that took place in 622. 624 is the first time that the armies of Islam, the armies of Muhammad, defeated a non-Muslim force on the field of battle, the Battle of Badr. And that is what the Eid al-Fitr commemorates. It is the defeat for the first time of non-Muslim, they would say, infidel forces on the field of battle by an Islamic army.
No, you're right, Claire, and I think sometimes people don't understand the linkages in history. I mean, the current fight really, as we look at it, is over a number of homes that initially, before there was even a state of Israel, you had Jewish groups purchasing land within the region. After, of course, you had that piece of property purchased that was sold to another Jewish group. When you had the Jordanians initially occupy the eastern side of Jerusalem, and then with the follow-on 67, when Israel was able to reclaim its territory, that piece of property is still being debated in the courts. The judge hasn't even made a decision on it yet, and look what it has led to. It is very volatile in the region. You have an issue of maybe a couple of houses where you're looking at settlement and property claims and who is the legal owner of it. And when the judge tried to say, okay, the Jewish groups that have purchased that property, you can have Arab settlers, or in this case Palestinians, live there, but they would have to pay their share of tax that you would do for any property owner. It became an issue that has led to the excuse for the fight that is taking place today. The other issues that I think maybe our audiences do not know about is the fact that, yes, we had another election in Israel. Unfortunately, there's no unified government. For you to have a unified government, you have to have at least 61 seats for any given capability. And within the parliament of Israel, you have Arab groups, you have left-wingers, you have right-wingers, and all these mixes. Even if you do have a government that is established, you're looking at a very thin margin for victory. I do want to touch upon some of the issues that have also come into play, which is the United States trying to get back to the JCPOA, and also, as you see here on the tweet, where there's confirmation that we knew this from a long time ago, as far as you and I are concerned, but at least in the open press now, that Al-Qaeda operations were launched out of Iran. And given with what is happening now, with Iran being influential there through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization supporting it, which China is the lead of and Russia is part of, it kind of has put us in a position where we really don't know where we're going to be in the future. And currently, with President Biden coming on even recently, pushing for the recognition of the Armenian genocide, puts us at odds with Erdogan, which you have written books about, and what Erdogan's doing in Libya and what he's doing in Syria. So give us where you think we're going to be at over the next couple of months, if not maybe in a year. Should U.S. get involved? I know that the Mossad leadership has said it's better off for the U.S. just not get involved in what is happening today. Should this administration have a say or no?
Well, what I would say is that right now in three crucial capitals, Washington, D.C., Jerusalem, Israel, and Ramallah, the capital, if you will, of the Palestinian Authority, there is disarray. And in the United States, of course, there is just an absence of leadership within the Middle East after President Trump had made such significant progress there among and between Israel and other Arab countries, and offering, the peace deal of a century to the Palestinians. At the current time, the United States leadership is simply AWOL; it's absent. But in Israel too, as you just alluded to, there is an unsettled situation with no one yet, after the fourth in a row elections, no one having been able so far to put together a coalition, a governing coalition, and uncertain now where that will head next. And then, of course, in Ramallah, with Abu Mazen, the president, who's now in, I forget which year, 12th, 13th, 14th, who's counting, year of a 4-year term, had called, against the advice of many of his own advisors, had called for new elections, but then realized what a terrible miscalculation that was, because obviously it's not Fatah, it's not the PLO that would win those elections at this point in time, it's Hamas. And Fatah, PLO, PA, are at daggers drawn with Hamas in Gaza. And so some mechanism had to be found to scuttle or to give Abu Mazen a reason, an excuse to cancel or at least postpone again those elections. And so that also is playing into the outbreak of violence being fed not just from Gaza by Hamas, but also out of Judea and Samaria by the Palestinian Authority-backed forces there. Already at least one team of attackers coming out of, I think it was Tulkarm, was stopped by the Israeli authorities on their way to do damage inside of Israel. So the disarray, again, at the top of the leadership of 3 capitals, Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Washington, D.C., I think really offers an opening and an opportunity for those who would cause disruption that we're seeing. It's an invitation.
It is an invitation. I have to tell you, from looking at it from a strategic perspective, that's what really wanted to look at here is how is China, influencing in the region, especially with the fact that they recently brokered at least an understanding with the Iranian leadership on $400 billion where they actually purchased Iran. I know you had written articles on the race revolution and the Chinese Communist Party and how some of that plays not just overseas, but also how it plays here. If you could kind of give us that little perspective as to this critical race theory concept and how it's playing out, not just in the Middle East, to an extent here on our streets, and whether or not, if people maybe not understand, these do have effects, especially on the protests that may take place as early as June, July, to even possible turmoil in our own country by August end. Talk to us a little bit about that and why you thought it was so important to write those particular articles just before the election.
Right. So as you mentioned, of course, China is sensing itself, feels itself to be a rising power, sees the United States as a declining power, intends fully to take our place as the hegemon, the global hegemon of the world. Part of that has to do with extending the reach of its Belt and Road Initiative into all parts of Asia, as far west, as you just said, as Iran. But as for the United States here, what is going on with what we sometimes call the red, black, green axis, red for communist Marxists, black Maoists, black for the Black Lives Matter movement, which is obviously Marxist, self-admitted Marxist, but also affiliated with Maoist-backed groups, and the green, of course, for Islam, standing for the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States and its front groups, which are intimately linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. And we know this from statements made in public by Nihad Awad, the executive director of CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, the Hamas chapter, essentially, in America. He made those comments as far back as December of 2015, pledging the backing of at least CARE, and by extension the Muslim Brotherhood in the U.S., the backing for Black Lives Matter movement. Now, go to the Black Lives Matter movement. We know it's Marxist because its three co-founders, African Americans, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, self-admit that they are Marxists. And of course, they come out of Marxist-oriented organizations like the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and Liberation Road before they founded Black Lives Matter back around 2013-14. Now, the connection with China goes this way. So China exerts a lot of influence inside of the United States, most especially through information operations. And they have an organization which in English is called the United Front Work Department. It is under the authority of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. Well, the United Front Work Department's job is propaganda, not just domestically inside of China, but here in the United States and elsewhere around the world. But here in the United States, Beijing uses its consulates. There were 5 before, New York City, Houston, Texas, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo closed the Houston consulate back in July of 2020, about coming up on a year ago. But they use those consulates, as well as, of course, the embassy in Washington, D.C., and the UN mission in New York, in addition, as focal points for collaboration between the United Front Work Department propaganda and U.S. media outlets in particular. By media, I mean print legacy media, Washington Post, New York Times. I mean, of course, the cable TV channels, MSNBC, and the regular TV channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, etc. And then, of course, online, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, of course, TikTok, and others. But they push their messaging out through those, and because each of those American-based companies and or their parent company has extensive business dealings inside of China, where they look at a 1.4 plus billion potential person market, they're not willing to jeopardize that, and they fall in line with the propaganda. Now, what happened in Houston is exemplary. So the reason that Secretary Pompeo gave for closing the Houston consulate last year was that the diplomats, that's air quotes, were using that consulate for espionage and intellectual property theft. Well, yes, that's what the Chinese do. And if they were going to close Houston for that reason, then why didn't they close the other 4? But they did not. There's a reason, and it's in the open source media, which is where I found it, and it goes like this. So the Chinese Communist Party sent an undercover unit of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, to the Houston consulate with a mission to collect a list of names of Americans they thought would be especially susceptible to messaging about rioting, protests in the streets, Antifa, and BLM. They drew up the list, and then they created TikTok videos that they pushed out to those American citizens on American soil to tell them how to stage protest demonstrations and riots in the streets. This was going on American soil. But Secretary Pompeo only closed the Houston consulate because that was the locus of that particular activity. But that is the sort of thing that is going on in terms of information operations. And beyond that, as I said, those messages that, TikTok messaging went out to Antifa, BLM, expected supporters, right? But in addition to that, there's more that's going on, and that'll get back to that article you just had up there from last, I think it was October 2020. I wrote that, and Epoch Times published it at its site, and it's called Race, Revolution, and the CCP, Communist Chinese Party. And the reason I wrote it is because there is a continuity of connection, ideological connection in any case, between the black revolutionaries of the 1960s, and I mean specifically the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale, Huey P. Newton, Robert Armstrong, not a Panther, but a black revolutionary, Elizabeth Brown. These are black revolutionaries from the 60s and early 70s who made regular trips over to Beijing. This is while Mao Zedong and his number two, Zhou Enlai, were still alive. They both died in 1976, but up until then, they were back and forth with delegations, and we know that because they turned them into photo ops, and the photo ops are available online. And the Chinese Communist Party was actively supporting and backing and encouraging these black revolutionaries of the 60s. Well, the Black Lives Matter movement leadership of today are, at a minimum, the ideological descendants of those revolutionaries from the 60s, although they do not, as far as I know, make those trips over to Beijing. I would think probably more at the discretion of Xi Jinping and the current Communist Party leadership there than a lack of willingness to go. But be that as it may, there is the same ideological alignment in terms of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the popular revolution. Remember, the 1960s was the time of the Cultural Revolution in China, rather similar to things that we see going on right now in America. And again, that ideological connection, BLM and its founders, those three women I mentioned before, directly connected to antecedents to BLM, like Road Socialist Organization and Liberation Road, which themselves did have Maoist connections. By the way, they also, various of the affiliates support Un's regime in Pyongyang and North Korea too. So that is, you know, just in a kind of a very brief nutshell, the ideological connection. The leadership, the international leadership of communism in the world today is coming out of Beijing. It is the CCP. It's not Moscow anymore. Although I'm not counting them out, I'm not sidelining them, but entirely. But I will say to Beijing today, not to Moscow.
No, you're right, Claire. And I'm glad that you're able to break it down in the way you did. Look, a lot of these organizations are tied together. You mentioned CARE itself. CARE does get funding and support. You'll be surprised from a lot of the areas that are tied to conglomerates or really Chinese-owned companies. And this is a reality of how this money flows. If you look, even in my neck of the woods recently, there was a resolution that was trying to be passed in the Chicago City Council, which was Chicago care about Indian immigration laws, because CARE introduced a resolution that was condemning Prime Minister Modi and was trying to really put at odds the Muslim and also the Hindu communities here. We were approached from the Near East, from the leadership from the Indian community to say, hey, can you kind of unravel this for us? Maybe there's something we're not saying. And I was able to put a paper together that we were able to get through a local mayor here to the City Council of Chicago, which has far leftists on it. But once they realize it's possible that it's tied to a Chinese information operation, and you have Chinese companies that are really behind even the Rohingya genocide that is taking place out of Burma, that's forcing a lot of those individuals into India, you realize that this is a strategic game plan by the Chinese Communist Party and part of their information operations to reach out and have effects even in Chicago. Why? Because China moves a lot of its money through Chicago. Chicago itself is one of the major cities that has a huge amount of GDP exchange between us and Chinese conglomerates. Now, luckily, even the fact that you had a city council that is really has a lot of far leftists in it that we're trying to support that CARES push to have those effects, went ahead and defeated that resolution. So there might be some positives there. As you said, you establish your own your company to alert and educate individuals in America on these international issues. And I'm hoping that we do a pretty good job as far as helping our audiences kind of tie everything together. What is happening on the streets of Israel is tied to what is happening with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what is happening with China's effects in the Middle East, to include the fact that even with the explosion that took place in Lebanon almost a year ago, you're looking at some of the technologies that China was wanted that ended up exploding. And that explosion that took place in the harbors in Beirut. So it is very important for us to kind of know that, understand that, and realize that a lot of the organizational structures here, even if they're getting money from legitimate businesses, if you unravel and peel the onion back, you realize that a lot of them are really tied to conglomerates in China. And given the fact that, as you said, majority of the staffs of the newspapers really get paid based on business ties to Chinese companies, it's very difficult for them to cut their bottom line to have any effects on China. I had put up an article that you saw there earlier. It was an article that we have, which I had written on the Wuhan virus, and we couldn't publish it here in the U.S. I had to go to Japan Forward to publish it because of the influence that Chinese information operations had on our press media here. Now, fast forward, everything that we said in that article is now coming up, and at least people are looking at it. I do know that China is very influential when it comes to Southeast Asia. So if you could tell us a little bit more about what is happening within Southeast Asia itself, given the fact that now we know what's happening in the Middle East region with the SCO, what is happening here in the U.S., a little bit more about the Southeast region, and then we'll bring you out for closing comments, and we'll probably have you back again next week because we just can't get everything in one show.
Right, there's so much going on. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it is very dangerous to permit the perception of a lack of leadership, of a lack of strength. And I'm talking about our own administration here in the United States right now. And so really every rogue actor on earth, and, we've talked about some of those, certainly among, the Islamic Jihad groups like Hamas, Fatah, PLO, in that part of the Middle East, certainly on the part of the Iranian regime, and obviously, of course, on the part of Beijing. And so each one of these, and I'll add, of course, Pyongyang and the regime of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, each one of these is now testing the new administration in the U.S. White House to see how far they can go, how far they can push before there's some kind of a response. And so in the Southeast Asian area, let's say in the area around China, we know that China has been threatening and not just with belligerent aggressive statements, but with incursions of Taiwan's airspace, of the economic exclusionary water zones around not just Taiwan, but around the Philippines, even Japan, just really pushing. Of course, they've created all of these island bases out of sandbars and atolls and what have you in the South China Sea, laying claim to that entire region for itself. It's got that 9-dash line, they call it, which they claim for their own. Unfortunately, of course, that 9-dash line cuts through the waters, territorial waters of many of China's neighbors, to include Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and others in the area. So China is pushing it. They're pushing to see how far they can go. And it's not just here domestically. We just talked about that domestically here in the United States, but in its own region. Everyone, the observers, let's say, analysts of East Asia, of China, expect that China will make some kind of an aggressive move to militarily take back Taiwan, which it views as a wayward province of China proper, make some kind of a move at some point in the near future. Now, there are Olympic Games scheduled in China in 2022, and the thought is that perhaps they might be waiting for those games to be held before they move so aggressively against Taiwan, just to preserve, image. But there's no doubt that at some point, Beijing is going to try to make a move militarily to reconquer Taiwan as they would see it, their wayward province. The question is, would the United States stand beside Taiwan? Would the United States defend Taiwan? We do not have a defense treaty with Taiwan, but there has been a long understanding, not just involving the sale of military weapons and defense systems and so forth to Taiwan, but an understanding that we defended its separateness, if you will. And to that end, President Trump re-energized what's called the Quad, the four countries of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, to form a united group in the region to stand up to Chinese aggression. To what extent the Biden administration, so badly compromised by China, would honor either the Quad arrangement or any kind of solidarity with Taiwan is a big question mark.
No, we're getting actually strong language coming out of Australia and the Australian administration. They're actually using the word war with China. And I don't think you'll ever hear that come out of this administration. I mean, even the most recent meeting that took place with the Prime Minister of Japan, going back a few weeks ago, President Biden was either directly or indirectly given the suggestions he gave to the Prime Minister of Japan. Really, a lot of our technology, especially when it comes to the chip technology, started flowing through Japan to companies in Taiwan that are tied to the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm not sure that I'm confident that we will take any steps to do the right thing, to stand by our allies and our friends when in the region. But I hope that we realize that China in the past, I would say, is up on the hill. They haven't secured it. We're looking up at them. I think if we continue in the route we are 5 years from now, it might be over when it comes to having any effects. What we used to call in the military was first and second and third order effects. And I think that what we decided to do years ago with technology transfer has led us to where we are today. Even what is happening on our southern borders, a lot of the money that the administration is pushing to try to get to South American nations in order to be able to supposedly take care of their issues so that we won't have the immigrant influx that is coming or the migration that is coming into the United States. A lot of that money is owned by those countries to the Chinese conglomerates. So they just turn around and basically launder back to China. And China is using our own taxpayer money to build islands in South Pacific areas, or the China Sea, if you want to call it that, and is turning around and using it to influence Iran, which Iran gives it its legs that it needs in the Middle East, to include having effects on specifically Israel's foreign policy now, given the fact that China can influence through the borders of Syria and also in Lebanon, and then turning around and being reckless with what it's doing, not just in South America, but also specifically even in our own country. So We'll have you back, Claire, because there's a lot there to kind of digest. And we're going to bring you back again next week, given the current events. I know it was important for us to kind of talk about what is happening in the Middle East region. The title, as you see there, says U.S. perspective on the CCP threat. We're not saying that everything's tied to China, but when China is trying to be global dominant, especially on all levels, to include the three lines of effort: security, governance, and development, whether it be currency manipulations or anything else, it does have effects on what is happening globally across the board, from the Middle East to our own country, South America, and also Africa and Southeast Asia. Claire, if people want to know more about you, where can they go to learn a little bit more about you?
Well, I do not yet have a website, but I do publish my writing and then put all of my videos up at places like the United West, Sharia Crime Stoppers, Citizens Commission on National Security, at the American Truth Project, Brannon House's World View Weekend, and I also am on social media. So you can find me at Clare M. Lopez. Can always use some more followers because Jack keeps taking them away. At Clare M. Lopez on Twitter. I'm also on Facebook, and Parlay the same.
Well, we're hoping that we can get you more viewers, and our viewers know if they look at the QR code and take a picture of it, it will take you directly to Claire's Twitter handle. Hey, Claire, you're everywhere. I don't know if you really need to have a website yourself, because you're all over the place. A lot of great places from across the globe, and you're doing a yeoman's job in covering the issues of the region. I'm going to first of all thank you again for coming here on the show. I'll give you the closing remarks, and then we're going to go to a video that's going to somewhat talk about South China Sea and talk about some of the issues that are there. But I'll give you the closing remarks, and then we'll finish up and see you next week.
Great. Well, thank you again for having me. Be glad to come again, back again next week. And I guess in closing, I would just repeat something I said earlier, and that is that permitting the appearance or the perception of weakness is the most dangerous thing that we can possibly do, because it invites aggression from those with a mind to it. So the perception of weakness wherever, whenever we allow that to happen is to our detriment. American national security will suffer.
Well said, Claire, and you're on point. With that said, we'll see you next week. God bless, and this is New Paradigms.
Thank you.
When you think of a territorial dispute, you often think of a conflict over land. But here in Southeast Asia lies what's known as the South China Sea. And if you want to know who controls the waters, well, good luck. It's going to depend on who you ask.
These are all of the countries that claim a piece of the South China Sea. Well, except China, which claims nearly all of it. And in recent years, China doubled down on that claim by building man-made islands with military facilities. In 2017 alone, these construction projects covered 72 acres. These new islands have made surrounding nations and even the United States pretty nervous. So what is it about this small body of water that makes it so desirable? For one, it's a massive shipping passage with $5.3 trillion worth of trade cruising through its waters every year.
That's nearly 1/3 of all global maritime trade. Second is, well, what's below the surface. Lots and lots of oil and natural gas.
How much exactly? The US estimates there's 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the South China Sea, while one Chinese government-owned oil company actually put the figure closer to 125 billion barrels of oil and 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in undiscovered areas. And when you think China consumes about 4.5 billion barrels of oil annually, well, that could potentially mean several decades worth of energy.
So it's understood why the South China Sea is one of the most disputed places on the planet. But why is its ownership left open for interpretation?
According to international law, every country has the right to claim up to 12 nautical miles from its coast as its territory. Meanwhile, a country can claim an exclusive economic zone extending up to 200 nautical miles for things like mining or fishing.
That's the law most governments around the South China Sea are following. But China's government says they have an exception. The 9-line.
The 9-line, originally the 11-line, first appeared on a Chinese map about 70 years ago. Now, Beijing argues this serves as historical evidence that it has a claim to up to 90% of the contested waters. The line is less than 200 miles away from some coastal areas of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, yet it reaches as far as 1,200 miles from the south of mainland China. So that's why in 2016, an international tribunal voted against China, saying it has no legal basis for its claims. Most of the region welcomed the news, but the Chinese government pretty much pretended the ruling never happened, building more artificial islands and bases since. American allies in the area might hope that the US will get involved, but Chinese officials recently gave the Trump administration a warning. The more ships the US brings to the contested waters, the more China will step up its presence.
Hey guys, it's Upton. Thanks for watching. For more of our videos, check out What is Alibaba here and What does China own in Australia here. We're also taking suggestions for future CNBC Explains, so leave your comments in the section below. And while you're at it, subscribe to our channel.